They told her she was too distracting to learn, just because of her hair. They thought silence would follow. But Big Shaq didn't yell. He built. What started as an expulsion became a movement, and the school board never saw the ending coming, because when giants stop walking and start digging, foundations crack. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. There's a certain kind of silence that follows the lives of giants. Not the roaring kind born from applause, but the quiet that settles when the world stops expecting you to roar. Shaquille O'Neal had learned to live inside that silence, not as a prisoner of his own legend, but as its architect. To the world he was Big Shaq, an icon, a household name, the man whose shadow once swallowed basketball courts whole. But here, in the southern stretches of Georgia, he was just Shaquille, just a man with wide hands, a slow walk and a presence that didn't need to ask for attention. It just was. He lived just outside the city line, on a wide plot of land, stitched with red soil and oak trees. No mansion flaunting his wealth, no gates screaming power, just a modest home, with creaky steps, and a basketball hoop that leaned slightly to the left. That hoop had seen stories. Kids from the neighborhood, the lost, the angry, the gifted, would come by to shoot around, not because they thought they'd go pro, but because they knew Big Shaq would watch. He'd offer water, advice, a quiet laugh. Sometimes he wouldn't say a word. He didn't need to. He poured money into what others overlooked. A failing music program at a local middle school, a crumbling community gym, scholarships for kids who couldn't even spell their own potential yet. He never wanted credit. He wanted roots, legacy, and his strongest root was Angel Reese. Angel wasn't his daughter, but Shaq loved her like his own. She had come into his life years ago, when his sister, struggling with health, finances, and heartbreak, asked him for something bigger than money. She asked him to raise her child the way only a man with both strength and softness could. Shaq said yes without blinking. From the moment Angel moved in, his house stopped being quiet. Not noisy, just alive. Angel had eyes that didn't blink under pressure. She wore her natural hair like a crown, and carried herself like she knew exactly who she was, and exactly what the world thought of that. She wasn't combative, she wasn't loud, but she was firm. That kind of presence made people uncomfortable, especially in school hallways and dress code meetings. Still, she flourished. A student of history, a poet, a natural leader. At 17, she was already applying to pre-law programs. She didn't dream of courtrooms and verdicts. She dreamed of policy, of making the rules that others had to obey. Her bedroom wall wasn't plastered with posters of celebrities. It was lined with quotes from Angela Davis, James Baldwin, and Maya Angelou. Angel wanted justice, but not the kind that screamed, the kind that lasted. Shaq watched her like a gardener watches the rarest flower, not controlling, just protective. She was the kind of girl who didn't just know she was special. She carried herself like she knew the world might punish her for it. Still, she didn't bend. Never. Their mornings were slow and grounded. She'd read her essays to him while he cooked eggs, and he'd listen like she was reading scripture. She teased him about being a gentle giant with a soft center, and he'd grin, telling her giants had to learn to tread lightly, or they'd crush everything without meaning to. It was their rhythm, peaceful, simple, purposeful. But peace has a shelf life. The signs were small at first. A PTA meeting, where a parent gave Angel a lingering look. A hallway whisper caught in the wind. A teacher's comment about distracting hairstyles that wasn't aimed at her directly, but might as well have been. Shaq noticed. Angel shrugged it off. That was her way, not because she was numb, but because she had learned the rules early. Respond too quickly, and they call you emotional. Stay silent, and they call you compliant. So she picked her battles, or so she thought. Shaq, on the other hand, watched and waited. He had lived through too many cycles not to sense when something was circling back. Racism didn't always arrive in boots. Sometimes it wore khakis and smiled while handing out detention slips. Sometimes it hid in policies written in polite ink. He began to feel the weight of the air change. Not drastically, but enough. Enough that he started lingering a bit longer at her school drop-offs. Enough that he stopped ignoring the board meetings he used to dismiss. Enough that he started writing things down. Dates, times, phrases he overheard. He wasn't paranoid. He was prepared. Angel never let on that she noticed. But she did. She noticed everything. That's what made her dangerous. Not to the people who loved her, but to the people who depended on silence. She was smart. Unapologetic. She didn't raise her voice. She raised her hand, and that was often worse for people who didn't like to be questioned. They lived like this, in that fragile space between vigilance and calm. The kind of calm that came before a storm. The kind where you convince yourself that everything is fine, just so you can sleep at night. And maybe that's why it hit so hard when it finally came. Because when Angel Reese was pulled from class and told she had violated the dress code for wearing her natural hair out, no braids, no bands, no tame edges, the calm shattered. And in the silence that followed, Shaq didn't yell. He just stood still. Still as a man who had once stood before the loudest arenas in the world, and now stood before something even louder. Injustice dressed as policy. Stillness, he knew, was the beginning of something. Stillness meant the giant was awake. It was one of those Wednesdays that felt like it had nothing to prove. The sky was clean, the air was light, and the world, as it often does before breaking, looked calm. Angel Reese walked into Willow Ridge High School, just like she had every day for the last 3 years. Head up, books in hand, headphones tucked around her neck, and a fresh twist-out puff that sat proud atop her crown. Her hair, coiled and bold, moved with her like it belonged to the wind. She hadn't planned it to be a statement. It was just wash day, and she felt good, whole, honest. She made it as far as her AP Civics classroom when the vice principal stopped her in the hallway. His face didn't wrinkle with anger, didn't harden with rage. It stayed smooth, tight-lipped, and procedural. "Angel, I'm gonna have to ask you to come with me," he said. No explanation, just instruction. The office was colder than usual, more clinical. The assistant principal, a woman who had always complimented Angel on her poise, now avoided her eyes. A paper was slid across the desk. Not a warning, not a conversation. An expulsion notice. Inappropriate appearance. Disruption to the educational environment. Non-compliance with grooming policy. The words were printed in small, legal tight font. Sterile, cruel in how they refused to acknowledge the girl sitting across from them as human. There was no outburst from Angel, no begging, no loud defense, just silence. Her jaw locked, her spine straight, her ancestors behind her. They asked her to call someone to pick her up. She didn't flinch. She nodded once, stood up, and walked out the way she came in. Only this time, not as a student, as a disruption. A violation. A problem with a pulse. Shaq was 5 miles away, crouched beside a box of team jerseys at the local rec center when his phone buzzed. It was a text from Angel. Not dramatic, not emotional. Just, "They sent me home," said my hair breaks code. Under it, a photo, her face composed, her hair flawless, her pride intact. He stared at the screen for longer than anyone noticed. His fingers, large enough to palm a basketball like a tangerine, paused in mid-motion over the uniforms. One of the kids called his name. He didn't respond. He didn't yell, didn't call the school, didn't post online. Shaq had learned a long time ago that some fights are too layered for noise. Some responses need space, precision, control. That night, Angel sat across from him at the dinner table, still wearing the same outfit she'd been sent home in. She told him the story slowly, not because she was hesitant, but because she wanted to be accurate. Her words didn't shake, her voice didn't rise, but each detail cut like glass. How the teacher looked at her during second period. How a white girl 2 seats down wore purple-dyed hair last week and got a compliment for creative expression. How the secretary in the office had offered her a rubber band and said, "If you tie it back, you can stay." How she refused. Shaq didn't interrupt. He just listened. Not as a celebrity, not as a man who could call news anchors by first name, but as her uncle. As a black man in America, who'd been told too many times what acceptable looked like. After she finished, she looked at him. "You're not going to go on TV or something, right?" He shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "I'm going to go to work." The next day, he pulled out her school's student handbook, printed every page, took a red pen, and circled every line that had even a whiff of coded language. Professional appearance must reflect community standards. Unnatural hair colors, extreme styles, or distractions will not be tolerated. Administration reserves the right to determine acceptability. Vague, subjective, perfect for abuse. He started a log, documented every known incident from the past 5 years, where a student had been sent home or disciplined under appearance-based infractions. His team helped him gather names, dates, context. In the margins he wrote in big block letters, "Who defines distraction?" Angel, meanwhile, received her official expulsion confirmation. No hearing, no grace. The school cited prior warnings that didn't exist. They made it seem routine, bureaucratic, nothing to see here. But there was something. There was everything. Over the next few days, news of her expulsion trickled out. Not in headlines, not yet, but in whispers. Social media threads. A girl's mother posted a vague story about natural hair discrimination at Willow Ridge. A local student podcast hinted at deep-rooted race issues hiding behind policy. Angel's name wasn't always mentioned, but the people who needed to know knew. Inside the school, tension bloomed like bruises. Teachers picked sides quietly. Some whispered apologies in the hall. Others avoided eye contact altogether. A black janitor left a sticky note on Angel's locker. "Your hair ain't the problem. Their eyes are." Shaq stayed quiet in public, but privately, he reached out to a civil rights nonprofit, to a constitutional law expert, to a former school superintendent who left the system because she couldn't stomach its hypocrisy. What he learned confirmed what he already suspected. This wasn't a misstep. It was a pattern. Black girls, in particular, were disproportionately disciplined for hair-based infractions, often under codes written in broad language to be selectively enforced. It was systemic, insidious, and invisible unless you knew where to look. Angel never asked him to fight, never told him to stand down either. She just went about her days with grace. She began tutoring at the rec center, organizing study sessions for younger girls. Her expulsion didn't make her shrink. It made her sharp. But Shaq knew something most didn't. He knew that silence like this, the kind that wrapped itself around policy and posture, wasn't weakness. It was armor. And behind armor people hide things. Lies, biases, and fear. He began building a case. Not a legal one. At least not yet. A moral one. One that couldn't be dismissed with PR statements or performative apologies. He wasn't interested in shouting over microphones. He wanted to reveal not just what happened to Angel, but what had been happening to dozens of students like her. Students without famous uncles, without platforms. The school board issued a vague statement about ongoing reviews of policy in accordance with district standards. They called Angel's situation regrettable, but justified. Shaq didn't respond, not yet. Instead, he visited the old gym where he first taught Angel how to throw a layup. He stood there looking at the backboard worn from years of use. The lines on the court had faded, but the structure stood firm. Kind of like her. That Friday, a young boy at the rec center asked him why he looked so serious. Shaq just smiled, knelt down, and tied the kid's shoes. Sometimes, he said, you gotta let the world think you're quiet before you roar. The storm was coming, but it wouldn't come with lightning. It would come with truth. The first article came out 3 days after the expulsion, published by a local outlet that usually covered bake sales and budget cuts. The headline read, "Dress Code Controversy Sparks Discussion at Willow Ridge." Underneath it, a sanitized version of events, a student removed for disruptive appearance, a school board acting in accordance with district guidelines, a quote from the principal that sounded like it was recycled from a crisis handbook. "We strive for professionalism and academic focus. No mention of Angel Reese. No mention of race. No mention of truth." By the end of the week, the story had leapt from neighborhood blogs to national news feeds. But the deeper it traveled, the more it warped. Dress code debate. Student hair policy raises eyebrows. Shaq's niece at center of school scandal. News anchors dissected the policy. Analysts argued over grooming standards. Former teachers chimed in with op-eds about maintaining order. And woven through all of it was a subtle, careful undertone, as if Angel had somehow invited controversy by existing the way she did. Social media was a different beast. Videos, duets, threads. People were furious. Clips of Angel from old interviews resurfaced. Photos of her natural hair went viral. Hashtags like "Let Her Learn" and "Crown Not Crime" started trending. Black women shared their own stories of being policed for the way they wore their hair. In schools, offices, grocery stores. It became a cultural moment. But moments fade. Shaq knew that. And this one was already being diluted into clicks and shares. Outrage without aim. The school board didn't flinch. They issued a press release with language so cold it felt almost weaponized. "We respect the cultural diversity of our students, but we must maintain an environment conducive to learning. Another line stated that policies are applied equally to all students, regardless of background. It was the kind of lie you could only tell if you never looked directly at the consequences. Through all of this, Shaq said nothing. No interviews, no tweets, no damage control. His silence became louder than any headline. People started asking where he was. Commentators speculated. Some praised his restraint. Others accused him of abandoning the moment. But Shaq didn't care. He wasn't silent out of fear. He was silent because he understood something the news didn't. This wasn't just a story. This was a system, and systems don't break when you yell at them. They break when you understand them. So he watched. He watched the board members' body language in interviews, the way they leaned forward when defending policy, leaned back when asked about bias. He watched public school footage, dug up old incident reports, highlighted inconsistencies. He wasn't just reacting, he was gathering, and in that gathering he was building a map. Angel, meanwhile, moved with a quiet kind of power. She refused all interview requests, declined podcast invites. When asked for statements, she simply said, "I'm not interested in being a headline." She went back to tutoring at the community center, started planning a reading series for Black girls who'd been suspended from school before they even knew how to spell systemic. Her calm unnerved people. They wanted anger, but she gave them purpose. At home, she and Shaq hardly spoke about the media storm. Their conversations were still about books, documentaries, ideas. He asked her what she thought about restorative justice. She asked him how many names he remembered from his NBA career, and how many of them he still called. In the quiet, they sharpened each other. But rage simmered beneath the calm. Shaq saw it in the way Angel gripped her pencil while doing case study notes, in the way she flinched when passing by the school's name on the community bulletin board. He saw it in the way she turned off the news when another commentator framed the issue as a misunderstanding. There was no misunderstanding. There was only the refusal to name what was happening. In Shaq, he felt his own rage differently. It didn't scream. It planned. He'd grown up in systems that called Black excellence a threat, unless it performed. He'd seen how quickly communities were gaslit into believing that rules applied equally, while entire generations were buried beneath the weight of exception. He knew the school board had made a miscalculation. They thought they were dealing with a man who'd come out swinging, who would burn hot and fast and then fade. But Shaq didn't burn fast. He waited. He'd spent decades learning how to move without warning. He began reaching out to people with no titles but deep truths. Custodians, cafeteria workers, substitute teachers who didn't sign NDAs. He learned about quiet punishments, racialized tracking, suspension rates, all tied together by the same thread. Policies that let you enforce without reason, punish without consequence. He met with a retired educator who showed him archived curriculum reviews that had been suppressed for not aligning with district tone. He found a community organizer who had a spreadsheet of every student disciplined in the past 5 years. Over 70% were Black. In a school that was barely 40% Black, the numbers didn't lie. They revealed. But none of this went public. Not yet. Shaq was drawing lines, connecting dots, not just to expose what had been done to Angel, but to prepare for what he was going to do next. This wasn't about payback. It was about disruption. He started working nights, making calls in quiet corners of the house. Angel once walked in to find him speaking in low tones, with someone from an education equity coalition. He smiled at her, covered the phone, and said, "Almost done." She smiled back, but her eyes searched his face. "You're building something," she said. He nodded. Always. Behind the scenes, momentum shifted. A group of Black parents began organizing a meeting to demand a revision of the appearance policy. A local newspaper quietly prepared a feature story titled "The Hidden Bias in School Policy." The Angel Reese case. Students began circulating a petition demanding Angel be reinstated. By the end of the week, it had 4,200 signatures. Half of them weren't even from the district. The school board called an emergency session. They claimed it was about district logistics, but everyone knew the real reason. Pressure. And it wasn't coming from protests. It was coming from data, documentation, truth. Shaq was still silent. When a journalist finally reached out to him directly, asking if he wanted to comment, he replied with a single sentence, "You'll know when I speak." He didn't need a camera to be heard. He needed timing. Because this wasn't about Angel alone. This was about every student told they had to flatten who they were in order to fit into a frame they never asked to be part of. It was about every rule dressed up in professionalism that really meant erasure. Shaq wasn't just waiting. He was loading the truth like a weapon. And when he was ready, he wouldn't just speak. He would unmake the silence. Shaquille O'Neal had seen game tape a million times over. He could read plays before they unfolded, catch patterns before they showed their face. What most saw as chaos, he saw as rhythm. And now, off the court and far from the spotlight, he found himself watching a different kind of footage. Pages of policy manuals, expulsion records, and outdated handbooks, flipping through each like slow-motion replays of something that had always been there but never named out loud. He wasn't looking for accidents. He was looking for a system that hid its intentions in clean language and careful tone. It began with a stack of student handbooks that covered the last decade. He laid them out across the floor of his study, each year a different shade of soft blue or brown, a different set of names on the school board letterhead. The language stayed mostly the same. Appropriate grooming, disruption-free appearance, administrative discretion. Shaq underlined every phrase that felt like a backdoor. He wasn't reading as an uncle or a celebrity. He was reading like a man building a case. What he noticed wasn't just what the pages said. It was what they allowed. The way subjectivity ran wild through policy, like someone had intentionally blurred the lines, just enough to make fairness seem flexible. Words like professionalism and standards floated without anchors. Who defined professionalism? Who decided which standards mattered? He flipped back through Angel's letter again, the one that cited her inappropriate appearance as grounds for removal. Her hair had never been the issue. Her audacity to wear it. Shaq started a spreadsheet. Student names, dates, offenses, outcomes, publicly accessible reports, mentions in newsletters, even posts from parents who'd long since moved their kids to other districts. There were patterns. Black students disproportionately marked for appearance violations, natural hairstyles, hoodies, unclean shoes. Girls told they were distracting because their presence didn't fit some internal dress code never written down but always enforced. Then came the visits, the kind no one saw coming. The first was to the school janitor, Mr. Langley, an older black man with a stoic face and hands that looked like they'd lifted lifetimes. He'd worked at Willow Ridge for 16 years. Shaq met him after hours, walking the halls that still smelled faintly of disinfectant and acrylic paint. At first, Langley was tight-lipped, but Shaq didn't press. He just listened. And in that silence, Langley opened up, not in bursts, but in fragments. There was a girl, about 3 years back, locked out of class over a head wrap. Said it was gang-related. She cried behind the lockers for an hour. Nobody wrote that part down. Shaq asked for the name. Langley gave it. The second visit was to Nurse Hearin, now retired but still active in local advocacy work. She kept detailed notes, journal entries, observations she'd written years ago about a girl sent home because her braids were unusually bright, even though no rule existed about hair color. She told Shaq she tried to speak out once, but the district silenced her with a reassignment opportunity that came with a non-disclosure agreement. It's not just who they punish, she said. It's how they record it. They flatten the stories. They clean up the mess with ink. The third was the most painful. An ex-board member, once celebrated for her diversity initiatives, now lived quietly 2 towns over. Shaq tracked her down after a tip from an education reporter. When he knocked on her door, she answered slowly. Thin, tired, wary. Her name was Patrice Holloway, and the last time she'd spoken publicly, she'd been escorted out of a board meeting in tears. She invited Shaq inside, eventually. And in the stillness of her small home, she told him the story behind her silence. The board isn't built to change, she said. It's built to delay. Anytime I brought up reform, they drowned it in further study. We had proof numbers, testimonials, audit reports, but they kept kicking the can until I broke. I had a breakdown, not because they yelled, because they smiled while doing nothing. She handed Shaq a box letters from students, parents, even other teachers. Many names had been redacted, but the stories were all there. Stories like Angel's. And worse, the box felt heavier than it looked. Shaq went home that night and didn't sleep. He spread the letters across the dining room table, and for the first time since Angel's expulsion, he felt something colder than rage. He felt confirmation. The rot was real, and it had always been there, hidden beneath bureaucratic layers and shiny mission statements. He built timelines. matched incidents against policy updates, traced which board members had been in power during which controversies. Some had been re-elected, over and over, by communities who never knew the full truth, because the truth had never been presented, only reports, sanitized summary, just enough language to seem objective, just enough distance to be deniable. He marked the connections in red ink, like veins running through a system that fed off silence. What struck him wasn't just how much had been hidden, it was how little had ever been challenged. Parents gave up, teachers moved on, students aged out, and the machine kept turning. But now it had stopped, because now someone was watching, who didn't need permission to keep looking. Someone who didn't have to worry about job security, or public perception. Someone who could take what he'd gathered and use it. Shaq wasn't interested in spectacle. He was interested in strategy. He started meeting with legal advisors, civil rights historians, education policy experts. Not to file a lawsuit, at least not yet, but to understand the full architecture of what he was up against. He didn't want to knock down a building. He wanted to expose its blueprint. Angel saw him less in those days. Not because he was absent, but because he was occupied. She understood. She moved through her own motions, writing essays, mentoring, planning a community forum for students with similar stories. They rarely spoke about what he was building. They didn't need to, because between them was a silent agreement. This was no longer about one expulsion. It was about every erasure that came before it. The rot was deep, but Shaq had spent his entire life learning how to endure pressure, how to keep standing in systems that weren't built for him. And now he wasn't standing alone. He was digging. And when he was done, the whole foundation would shake. The first knock came in the form of an anonymous email sent to his private foundation account. No greeting, no name, just an attachment and a one-line message. She wasn't the first. She won't be the last. But maybe she'll be the one who makes them look. The file inside was a PDF, a teacher evaluation from 3 years ago. The subject was a student named Jalen Porter, a sophomore with a 3.9 GPA, and a full ride promise from a science institute. She had been expelled for verbal aggression, after confronting a teacher who told her that her afro made it hard for students behind her to see. The teacher's statement was recorded, but the incident was logged under disciplinary action, disruptive behavior, and Jalen's transcript had never been corrected. That email led Shaq to Delaney Wolfe. Delaney was a former English teacher at Willow Ridge, who had left abruptly mid-semester without any official explanation. Her name had come up in 3 different conversations. Always whispered, always avoided. Shaq tracked her down through a librarian friend, who ran a literary nonprofit. They met at a quiet corner cafe on the edge of downtown, the kind of place with books on the walls and no Wi-Fi. Shaq arrived early, sat in the back booth, and waited. Delaney walked in 10 minutes late, wearing an oversized sweater, and eyes that had seen too much. She sat across from him without ceremony. "I knew you'd come eventually," she said, sliding a manila folder across the table. Shaq didn't open it immediately. He looked at her. "Why did you leave?" Delaney didn't blink. "They asked me to watch my tone when I raised concerns. Told me my language was too emotional. Said I was creating division. I had been documenting bias and discipline for over a year. I had spreadsheets, testimonies. Then my classroom budget disappeared. My AP classes were reassigned, and I was given a hallway lunch duty schedule that made it impossible to prep. It was a slow squeeze, and I couldn't breathe." The folder she gave him was filled with her records. Handwritten notes from students, emails from administrators, subtly warning her to stay in line, and a list of students disciplined under what she called floating violations, things that weren't in the handbook but were used often enough to be understood. Attitude, presentation, perceived disrespect. "These aren't rules," she said. "They're weapons." Shaq thanked her. She didn't smile. She only said, "Make it matter." The second name came from his mother, Lucille. She called him after midnight, her voice low, but clear. "You need to speak to Kenrick Vaughn," she said. "He taught me law at Spelman. He sees what you're trying to do." Judge Kenrick Vaughn had been retired for a decade, but remained a force in Atlanta legal circles. His rulings in civil liberties cases had been cited nationwide, and his advocacy for educational equity dated back to the late. Shaq remembered him vaguely. A tall man with sharp words and soft hands. They met in a private room at a law library downtown. Vaughn arrived with 2 briefcases and a steel cane. His eyes still sparked like fire beneath his gray eyebrows. "You think you're building a case," Vaughn said. "Not as a question. You're not. You're building a mirror." Shaq nodded, understanding immediately. To show them who they've been all along. Vaughn opened the first briefcase and revealed what he called the quiet archive. Reports submitted to state oversight committees that were never published. Letters from parents that were redirected instead of addressed. A policy report sealed and marked internal use only, outlining strategic ambiguity and code enforcement as a technique for maintaining cultural cohesion. They literally wrote down how to discriminate and made it sound like strategy. Vaughn's. Shaq's hands clenched the edges of the report. How is this not already public? Vaughn looked at him, because most people don't know what they're holding when they find it. But you know. By the end of the night they had a plan. Delaney provided them with first-hand accounts and internal staff patterns that matched known bias cases. Vaughn offered legal context and precedent, how policy that claims neutrality but results in disproportionate harm can be challenged, not as opinion but as fact. Shaq became the connector between them, translating outrage into organization. They began cross-referencing testimonies with data, verifying every claim, building a timeline that showed how systemic erasure operated not as error, but as design. It wasn't just about Angel anymore. It was about a pattern of cultural targeting dressed up as discipline. As they worked, others began to appear. A school counselor who had left quietly 2 years ago. A parent whose son was denied re-enrollment after refusing to cut his locks. A former administrative assistant who revealed the district had an unofficial watch list of students considered non-conforming. Each new voice didn't just add to the pile. It widened the lens. And Shaq, at the center of it all, remained composed. He moved through this new network like a general, not barking orders, but creating space. Giving people a place to finally be heard, to finally believe that the silence they'd swallowed for so long might become something loud, something undeniable. He didn't share anything publicly, not yet. But behind the scenes, the arsenal was growing. Not of weapons, of witnesses, of records, of unspoken truths ready to speak. What they were building couldn't be shut down with a press release or buried under a vague apology. It was too structured, too real. And as each document fell into place, as each testimony found its echo, Shaq began to feel the weight of something heavier than anger. He felt momentum. The system that had tried to erase Angel was now being watched, cornered, and slowly dismantled by the very people it had discarded. He wasn't alone. And the strangers who had once carried fire quietly, now they carried it together. And they were ready to burn the mask off the machine. Shaq didn't post about the hearing. He didn't announce it in interviews, or call for crowds. He didn't stand on stages, or take to the mic. What he did was far quieter. He showed up in community centers, barbershops, church basements, and after-school halls. Places where real stories lived, not to lead, not to lecture, to listen. At the Milltown Youth Shelter, he spent hours speaking with young men suspended for everything from hoodie violations to sagging pants. Their records were filled with coded language, non-compliance, defiance, presentation issues. One 17-year-old named Carter told Shaq, "They say dress codes ain't about race, but it's funny how only we keep getting caught in them." Shaq didn't argue. He just nodded and added Carter's story to the ledger in his mind. In a barbershop on Vine Street, he sat for nearly 3 hours without a haircut, just listening to fathers trade stories about the time their daughters were pulled aside for distracting hairstyles, while white girls wore glitter extensions to school spirit rallies. "They always find a way to make our pride their problem," one man said, his voice low, "and then they write it down like it's our fault." At a small church in the North End, he attended a forum hosted by local teachers and activists. They had gathered long before Angel's case made headlines, working under the radar, documenting racial disparities in school discipline. They showed Shaq pie charts and case logs, audio testimonies from students too scared to speak in public. The evidence was damning, but it wasn't just the data that moved Shaq. It was the quiet fury behind it, the kind that had been building for years, waiting not for a savior but for a spark. He didn't give a speech. He never asked for attention. What he gave them was space and strategy. By the time the hearing approached, there were no official protest signs, no mass emails. But the city was stirring, not frenzied, focused. Angel's name appeared not on posters, but in lesson plans, in poetry slams, in public art. Students began posting black and white photos of themselves in natural hair with the caption, "Let me learn." It spread from Georgia to Baltimore, to Los Angeles. The movement wasn't viral. It was rooted. Shaq met with Delaney Wolfe again. She had collected over 24 written statements from current and former teachers, all citing inconsistent application of grooming codes. Judge Kenrick Vaughn had filed an official brief with the county outlining civil grounds for investigation if the board failed to act justly. And yet there were no threats, no ultimatums, just documentation, layered, undeniable, precise. The night before the hearing, Shaq and Angel sat outside under the backyard string lights. They said little. She was calm, as she'd always been, not because she didn't care, because she understood her power wasn't dependent on their approval. "You ready?" he asked. "I was ready the day they told me I wasn't enough," she replied. He smiled, knowing this wasn't a battle she'd chosen, but it was one she had transformed. The next morning, the board auditorium filled slowly. Local news vans parked in front. Metal detectors were placed at the entrance, as if truth posed a physical threat. Rows of staff, students, parents, alumni, and legal observers trickled in. Some wore suits, some wore sweatshirts with Angel's name printed in script. Everyone sat. Everyone waited. Shaq arrived 10 minutes before it started. Alone. No entourage. No cameras in tow. He walked down the center aisle, without looking left or right. Took his seat in the third row. Folded his hands. Said nothing. The board members looked out at the crowd and saw no chaos. No outbursts. Just eyes. Hundreds of eyes. Watching. Measuring. They didn't know it yet, but they were no longer in control. When the session opened, the board chair began with a practiced welcome, followed by an explanation of the format. A slide deck was queued up, summarizing the district's position. Charts, policy quotes, phrases like community standards, and professional alignment. It was everything Shaq expected. A presentation designed to appear neutral, to sound reasonable. Then came the testimonies. Delaney Wolfe read first. Calm, clear, with timestamps and source notes. She spoke of a student who was told her Bantu knots were inappropriate for academic focus, of how policy language was left deliberately vague to allow selective enforcement. She submitted her documentation into the record. Next was a mother whose son had been told to fix his appearance because his locks were causing concern. She'd been afraid to speak before, not to. Then came Judge Vaughn. He didn't raise his voice. He read from the sealed report that had never seen light until now. Read it slowly, purposefully, word by word. Then he looked the board dead in the eye and said, "This is not a hearing. This is a reckoning. And I suggest you act accordingly." Shaq didn't speak. Not yet. He sat there, a fixed presence. Monumental. But when Angel walked to the front, composed, steady, the room shifted. She didn't need notes. She didn't need to shout. She just said, "This isn't about hair. It never was. This is about erasure. And we're done being erased." No applause. Just stillness. The board chair cleared his throat, fumbled for response. Promised a decision by week's end. Promised reflection. But everyone in that room already knew. The board hadn't just walked into a hearing. They'd walked into the center of a movement. And Shaq? He hadn't come to speak. He'd come to witness. Because sometimes, the most powerful sound in the room is the one that waits for everything else to fall quiet. The morning air was unusually still, as if the city itself was holding its breath, not in anticipation of violence or drama, but of something deeper truth approaching. The courthouse turned hearing hall sat heavy with tension, a building so accustomed to empty formalities that it didn't know what to do with the weight of actual accountability. People lined the sidewalks, not to protest but to bear witness. They weren't chanting. They weren't marching. They were simply present, wearing silence like armor. Inside, the boardroom buzzed with a different kind of anxiety. Chairs squeaked under shifting weight. Laptops opened. Staff whispered in nervous loops, glancing toward the entrance every time the door nudged. At exactly 9:02 a.m., the door opened, and the Lion walked in. Shaquille O'Neal stepped into the boardroom with a calm that didn't ask for attention. It commanded it. He was dressed in all black. No flashy logos. No entourage. Just a long black coat, black dress shoes, and a single silver ring on his left hand, engraved with initials no one could read from afar. His posture was straight, not stiff. His face unreadable, not cold. He didn't bring a folder, a binder, or a prepared speech. He brought present, and that in this room was enough to tilt gravity. People turned as he passed, eyes trailing him with something between reverence and fear, not of what he might do, but of what he might reveal. He took his seat in the second row. Not front and center, just close enough to be felt. Angel sat beside him, a calm echo of his energy. She wore a deep maroon blazer, her natural curls cascading unapologetically across her shoulders. If Shaq was the storm, Angel was the still water beneath it, deep, steady, and impossible to move. The chair of the board, a man named Holloway, with polished shoes and a nervous smile, cleared his throat and began with routine. He welcomed attendees, acknowledged the unique interest in the case, and outlined the schedule for public statements. He used words like respect, clarity, and commitment to fairness, all delivered with the careful tone of someone hoping to survive the hour without consequence. Then, as the scheduled speakers filed through their time slots, advocates, parents, educators, there came a pause, a long, deliberate pause in which no name was called, no mic was offered. And yet Shaq stood up. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't need it. He simply walked to the podium, hands empty, eyes scanning the board with the gaze of someone who had seen systems like this before, dressed in different names and languages. He exhaled once. Then he began. "I don't have a title here," he said. "Not as a lawyer, not as a politician. I'm here as a man who's watched something dangerous hide in plain sight." He paused. The room didn't move. "I've read your handbook, the whole thing, and I'm going to read some of it back to you. Because sometimes we forget what we wrote down when we never meant to follow it." He pulled a folded page from his coat and read, "All students will be treated equally regardless of race, gender, or background. Dress and grooming policies are to be applied uniformly to ensure a safe and distraction-free environment." Then he looked up. "Now let me tell you what that sounds like in practice." He didn't shout, didn't pace. His voice was low, controlled. Every word dropped like a gavel. He told them about Angel, how she was told her hair was a disruption, while her white classmates wore dyed streaks and got compliments. He told them how she was sent home for being uncooperative, even though all she did was exist without apology. He detailed the timeline, the meetings that didn't happen, the appeal that was never offered, the policy that was applied not equally, but strategically. Then he moved to the other. He spoke of Jalen Porter, expelled for aggression, because she questioned a teacher's comment about her afro blocking someone's view. He read a note from a mother whose son was asked if he was in a gang because of his braids. Each story sharper than the last, each one anchored not in emotion, but in fact. Names, dates, direct quotes, records filed, witnesses present. And then he did something no one expected. He began reading their own language, lines from internal reports, and training memos obtained through backdoor channels and reluctant hands. In one document, Shaq said, "You refer to grooming reinforcement tactics." In another, behavioral reorientation methods. You use phrases like re-establishing order and managing disruption optics. But not once do you say what you really mean. You mean silencing. You mean erasure. He stepped slightly closer to the table, still calm, still steady. "You wrote this language to hide what you didn't want to say out loud. But we're not in the era of hiding anymore." One of the board members shifted, lips parting to interrupt. But Shaq raised a hand, not forcefully, just high enough to hold the air. "You've built a structure that punishes difference. Then you dress it up as discipline. You made rules that can be enforced unevenly. And now you pretend you don't know why that keeps happening." A low murmur moved through the crowd, but Shaq didn't acknowledge it. His eyes stayed fixed on the board. "I'm not here to tear this school down. I'm not here to file lawsuits or throw microphones. I'm here to tell you something simple. We see you. We see you. Not the version you put in pamphlets. Not the version you present at budget hearings. The real one. The one these kids survive every day." He paused. For the first time, his voice cracked slightly, not from anger but from depth. "And I'm here to say, your silence is no longer safe." He stepped back, left the page on the podium, turned and walked slowly back to his seat. No applause, no sound, just the weight of the moment, sinking into every corner of the room. The board tried to continue. Holloway stammered something about understanding perspectives, but the energy had changed. There was no recovering the room. Shaq hadn't delivered a speech. He'd delivered a reckoning, not a performance, a mirror, and everyone had seen their reflection in it. When the session closed, Shaq stood without rush. He turned to Angel, nodded once, and together they exited through the side door, not because they were avoiding cameras, but because they didn't need them. They weren't the story. The system was. Outside, the crowd stood in a silent wave. Some clapped once. Others simply placed their fists to their hearts. Shaq didn't wave. He didn't speak. He just walked, his frame casting a shadow that stretched far beyond the building. It wasn't about volume. It wasn't about fame. It was about presence. And on that day, in that room, presence had done what noise never could. It had made the powerful listen. 3 days after the hearing, the board released a statement that felt more like a shrug than a response. It avoided Angel's name altogether. It called Shaquille O'Neal's words emotionally compelling, but structurally inaccurate. They framed his testimony as a personal narrative, rather than evidence. While we appreciate Mr. O'Neal's passionate remarks, the statement read, "It is our duty to uphold district standards with clarity and consistency." Not a single line acknowledged the policy's racial bias. Not a single phrase admitted failure. What the board didn't understand, what they couldn't afford to understand, was that this wasn't just about what they said, it was about what they revealed. And what they revealed was simple. They were more concerned with preserving structure than pursuing justice. Shaq didn't reply. Not publicly. He didn't post a clapback. He didn't go on television. Instead, he went quiet again. But this silence felt different. Not the silence of restraint, the silence of preparation. For the next 10 days, nothing came out of his camp. No statements. No rebuttals. Angel remained low-key as well. She declined every invitation to appear on morning talk shows. She kept tutoring, kept showing up for her community, but if anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed something strange. People who had been aligned with Shaq Delaney Wolf, Judge Vaughn, several school activists, had suddenly gone dark. No panels, no interviews, no new comment. It was the kind of quiet that makes power nervous. On a crisp Friday morning, a few weeks after the hearing, the board gathered for what was supposed to be a routine facilities planning meeting. The agenda included maintenance budgets, equipment bids, and lease renewals for 3 of the district's rented properties, including the building that housed Willow Ridge High School. The room was half empty. Reporters didn't bother attending. The fire had died down, they thought. The storm had passed. Then came the item labeled, lease discussion, parcel ID. The board's property manager stood to give an update. His voice was dry, steady. "This is the current leaseholder information for Willow Ridge campus," he began, flipping through slides on the projector. "We've operated under a 10-year agreement with Civic Prop Holdings LLC, effective through the end of this fiscal year. Per the most recent title transfer," he paused, and then he said it. "The property was acquired last week by a newly formed entity, Rise Legacy Group." Silence. Someone on the board asked too casually, "And who owns that entity?" The manager turned. "Majority shareholder is Shaquille O'Neal, backed by a consortium of anonymous donors." Silence turned to static. The board chair leaned forward, blinking rapidly. "I'm sorry, Shaquille O'Neal?" The manager nodded. "That's correct. Ownership confirmed. Transfer notarized. Full rights effective immediately." The room felt like it tilted, not just because of the name, but because of what it meant. The board didn't own the building anymore. The walls they used to dictate policy inside now belonged to someone else. Outside, news was already breaking. Shaq had timed the announcement for 10:00 a.m. A press release from Rise Legacy Group hit in boxes across the state. Its language was clean, sharp, and free of fluff. Effective immediately, Rise Legacy Group has acquired the property at 411 Belmont Avenue, formerly leased to Willow Ridge High School. At the end of the current lease term, the facility will become the home of Reese Academy for Civic Integrity, a tuition-free charter institution founded on principles of equity, dignity, and community-driven education. Reese Academy will open in the fall of next year. Applications open this spring. The name hit harder than anything else. Reese Academy. The girl they'd tried to erase was now the name on the door. And it didn't stop there. The second paragraph introduced the Academy's founding advisory panel, which included education reform leaders, civil rights advocates, and at the very top, Angel Reese. Not as a student, not as a figurehead, as a builder. Every word in the release was precise. There were no attacks, no bitterness, just clarity. The new school would focus on critical thinking, cultural literacy, and civic justice. It would offer mentorship, mental health resources, and college pipeline support, and it would be open to every student. The old system had failed. The media exploded. The same networks that had once questioned Angel's hairstyle were now asking for exclusive tours. Former critics tried to rebrand themselves as early supporters. But Shaq declined every interview. He didn't need the press. He had already spoken. By mid-afternoon, the board's official channels were flooded with requests. Students were asking about early transfers. Parents wanted clarity on district school options. A few teachers resigned quietly, hoping to apply for positions at Reese Academy. And then came the final blow. An op-ed from Judge Kenrick Vaughn, published in the Atlanta Times under the headline, "If They Won't Change the System, Buy the Foundation." The piece didn't gloat. It dissected. It laid bare how power protects itself through policies that sound neutral but punish specifically. How districts delay reform by studying what they already know to be true. And how communities, when armed with truth and resources, no longer have to beg for change. They can build it. At the center of it all was Angel. In her only public appearance that week, she spoke briefly at a community forum. No cameras, no podium, just a folding chair and a microphone passed hand to hand. "I didn't ask for this," she said. "I didn't want to be the reason for a movement. I just wanted to learn. But they made me a problem. So now, I'm part of the solution." Reese Academy isn't revenge. It's what happens when you stop waiting for permission to matter. The crowd didn't cheer. They stood, silent, united. At home, Shaq watched from the back of the room. He didn't speak, just listened. Just like he always had. That night, sitting on the porch with Lucille, his mother asked him what it felt like, knowing he'd turned a policy failure into a legacy. Shaq thought about it for a long time, then said, "They wanted to clip her, so I built a place where she could fly." He didn't smile when he said it. He didn't need to. Because this wasn't a win in the traditional sense. This was something rarer, a reset. The board hadn't just lost a fight. They'd lost relevance. The ground they stood on wasn't theirs anymore. Literally and metaphorically, the future had moved on. And all they could do now was watch the school they once ruled turn into something they never saw coming. A place they no longer controlled, and a name they could never forget. Movements don't always begin with fire. Sometimes they begin with a refusal to shrink. One girl walks out of a school building because her hair is deemed disruptive, and suddenly that quiet defiance echoes louder than any speech. That echo, carried by witness and wire, finds new voices in new cities, and before long, what started as an expulsion turns into a ripple across the nation. Not a tidal wave of chaos, but waves in the water, widening with purpose, pressing outwards, touching everything. In Chicago, it begins with a sophomore named Lex. She shows up to school with her natural curls out for the first time in years, tied with a red ribbon. When asked by her teacher to consider tying it back, she calmly places a copy of the Reese Academy press release on her desk. She's sent to the office, but the moment goes viral. The next day, 27 students across the district show up wearing their natural hair with the same red ribbon. They call themselves the Crown Collective. In Philadelphia, a group of black and brown students at an all-girls prep school draft a formal petition calling for the removal of all dress code policies that target hair texture, head wraps, or cultural expression. They include detailed case studies, quotes from Angel Reese's story, and data from civil rights law. When the school administration tries to delay the review, the students stage a silent sit-in during their free period. No signs, no slogans, just present. The local paper calls it the quietest protest this city's ever heard, and the most powerful. In Oakland, a high school art teacher gives her students an open prompt. Draw what power looks like. Over half the class sketches variations of angel hair full, head high, some even with a small lion walking beside her. The teacher turns the drawings into a wall-length mural titled Scene. It sparks conversations at school board meetings, PTA gatherings, and eventually leads to the district reviewing its entire code of conduct framework for embedded bias. What's remarkable isn't just the scale of the movement. It's how it stays rooted in dignity. There's no looting, no shouting matches on morning TV, no attempts to make heroes out of individuals. The narrative is collective, built from lived experiences, not headlines. And at the heart of it, there is Shaq, absent from the cameras, but present in every meaningful way. He refuses all interview requests, not because he's hiding, but because the story was never about him. Instead, he works in the background, quietly partnering with educational nonprofits, legal firms, and historically black colleges to launch an initiative that funds civil rights-based curriculum in 40 schools across the country. The program, called Legacies in Motion, includes history modules, discussion guides, and local mentorship tracks that help students explore systemic inequality, and how to dismantle it with tools, not trauma. The curriculum is piloted in schools where students were once suspended for head wraps, braids, or non-compliant grooming. Now those same students are writing essays about justice and presenting them at city council meetings. Shaq funds it all, quietly, fully, with no strings attached. He's often seen visiting these schools, but never with a camera. He attends a poetry reading in New Orleans, a youth debate in Baltimore, a curriculum review in Kansas City. In every space, he speaks less than he listens, takes notes, gives nods, offers hugs that make high school athletes feel like they're wrapped in a fortress. When asked by teachers, principals, even curious students, why he won't speak to the press, Shaq smiles and says, "They had their turn to talk. I'm just here to build now." The only public words come from Angel. They're spoken at a roundtable event hosted by a small educational equity group in Atlanta. The event isn't live streamed. It isn't even widely advertised. But someone records it on their phone, and the clip circulates quietly, like a secret passed between hands. Angel is sitting in a circle, surrounded by students. No stage, no microphone, just folding chairs and a stack of books in the background. When someone asks her how she feels about the movement, she thinks for a moment, then says, "We weren't trying to fight. We were trying to be seen. And maybe now, people finally understand the difference." The room falls silent. One girl starts to cry. Another says thank you, like it's a prayer. The clip reaches 1 million views in under 24 hours. But it's not the numbers that matter. It's the tone. It's the way the message settles into people. Not like a shockwave, but like a weight that reminds them to sit straighter, walk prouder, speak clearer. In the months that follow, states begin introducing bills to prohibit hair-based discrimination in schools. More districts revise their appearance codes. Some invite local students to help rewrite them. A few even issue formal apologies to students who were punished under past policies. One principal in a tearful address says, "We failed to recognize that rules can be equal and still unjust." At Reese Academy, construction begins on a wing dedicated to social justice and civic leadership. Angel insists it include a media lab, because the next movement needs its own storytellers, she says. A mural goes up outside the new building, a long wall of silhouettes in profile, each one wearing their hair in different natural styles. Below them, a quote in bold black letters reads, "We are not what they said, we are what we made of it." Shaq visits the site alone, one morning, walking the perimeter slowly. He pauses in front of the mural, tracing the edge of one painted silhouette with his eyes. Behind him, a few students gather near the temporary fencing, whispering excitedly. One of them calls out, "You built this?" Shaq turns, nods once. "No," he says, "we did." Then he heads inside. There's a meeting starting. A new curriculum to review. A new program to pilot. The water hasn't stopped moving. And the waves? They're only getting stronger. The sun was soft that evening, the kind that wrapped around your shoulders instead of burning your skin. In the backyard of a modest 2-story house just outside Atlanta, Shaquille O'Neal sat on a wooden bench that creaked under his weight, a cup of cold tea resting beside him, a yellow legal pad on his lap. The backyard wasn't landscaped for show. No water features, no statues, just the steady presence of earth. Trees curved like quiet elders. Grass moved in the breeze like it had nothing to prove. It was the kind of place you didn't decorate, because it was already complete. He sat there, pen in hand, the sun tracing the arc of a day that felt heavier than most. The hum of cicadas pressed against the silence like a second heartbeat. And then, slowly, Shaq began to write. "Mama, I'm sitting in the yard you picked the first time you came to see this house. You said the oak in the back looked like something that had stood through storms, that it reminded you of Grandma's tree in Newark. You said, if you can see peace from the kitchen window, you'll survive anything. You were right. Again." The words didn't come fast, but they came true. Not with the practiced rhythm of speeches or statements, but with the honesty only a son could give to his mother. "I need to tell you what happened, and not because I think you missed it. I know you've been watching, even when the cameras weren't rolling, but I owe you the whole truth, not the headlines, not the bullet points. The real thing, the thing underneath it all. It started with Angel. You always said she had your fire. I didn't believe you at first. I thought she was just strong. But now I know, she's something else. Something bigger. A storm wrapped in patience. A truth that doesn't need permission to exist." He paused, looking up toward the sky. A bird flew overhead, alone, cutting across the fading blue, without flapping once. He watched it until it vanished behind the trees. The day they told her she was a distraction because of her hair, I felt something break. Not in her. In me. I remembered every room I ever walked into where I had to dim myself just to make people feel safe. Every time I was told to adjust, to compromise, to comply for peace, but it was never about peace, it was about silence. They told Angel her hair was unprofessional. They said it disrupted the learning environment. But what they meant was that it reminded them they weren't in control, that she didn't ask for approval, that she came into the room whole and didn't flinch when their systems tried to shrink her. The pen moved slowly, but each word was carved with care. There was no audience here, no pressure to deliver anything polished, just memory, just truth. At first I wanted to speak out, Mama, to call the press, to show my teeth. But I heard your voice in my head, that one you used when you wanted me to stop being loud and start being smart. You used to say, make them reach for your silence, make it cost them. So I didn't shout. I waited, I listened, I gathered. And what I found, it was worse than I thought. This wasn't about one policy, it was a blueprint, a strategy dressed in neutral language. They weren't failing kids like Angel by mistake. They were failing them on purpose, with intent, with structure. I met people, Mama. Strangers with fire in their chests. Teachers who lost their jobs for caring too much. Judges who remembered you from the old days. Parents who had buried their anger in folded notes and unfiled complaints. And together we pulled back the mask. The tea was now warm from sitting in the sun. But Shaq didn't touch it. His hands stayed on the paper, moving with purpose. The board tried to control the story. Said I was emotional. Said I didn't understand the system. And they were right. In one way, I didn't understand how deep the roots were. But I learned enough to stop asking for permission and start drawing new lines. So I bought the building, Mama, the one they leased, with the help of donors who didn't need credit. We're turning it into something they can't touch. Reese Academy, a school where being different won't get you punished. A place where kids will learn about their rights before the world tries to convince them they don't have any. Angel's not just a student there. She's building it with us. She's on the advisory panel. She wrote the mission statement herself. A school where truth isn't extra credit, it's the foundation. I read that line out loud and had to step outside just to breathe. He wiped his brow with his sleeve. Not from heat, from the weight of memory pressing itself out onto paper.
I haven't given any interviews. Haven't stood on a podium. Haven't tried to be the face of anything. Because this isn't about being seen. It's about what happens when you let people be whole. Angel said something a few weeks ago. She said, we weren't trying to fight, we were trying to be seen. And I thought about how many times you told me the same thing, in different words.
You didn't raise me to win arguments. You raised me to build tables. And now we're building one she can sit at. One where no one will ever tell her to cut her hair or dim her voice, or shrink her power. The wind picked up. A leaf landed on the page. Shaq brushed it off gently, then leaned forward to finish what he started. It's spreading, Mama. Not just in Georgia. Chicago, Oakland, Philly. Classrooms are changing. Students are walking into school with their heads high. Not because we gave them power, but because we reminded them they already had it. Some days it feels too big. Other days not big enough. But every time I see her smile, I remember, it's working. Not because they lost, but because she didn't. He stopped. Looked out across the yard. Fireflies were beginning to dot the grass. Like low stars, blinking in rhythm with a sky that hadn't forgotten how to forgive. Then, slowly, he wrote the final lines. They saw a problem in her hair, but I saw a crown. And now the whole world sees it too. He signed it, folded it once, and placed it in the old cigar box where he kept letters that mattered. Letters to his kids, to teammates, to himself. But this was for the woman who first taught him how to be still without being silent. The backyard was quiet now. Not empty, just full of everything that needed no words. The letter was done. The movement was not. And in that stillness, a truth stood taller than any man ever could. Sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is simply stand still until the world moves with him. If this story stirred something in you, don't scroll past it. Share it at your dinner table. Bring it to your school board. Print it and leave it in a teacher's lounge. Movements don't need millions to begin. just someone who refuses to look away. The next crown deserves safer ground. Help us build it.